Fuel for Revolt. Moral arguments as delegitimation practices in Swedish fuel protests. Climate change is a pressing global issue that demands radical changes in policies to transition towards a low-carbon future. For these policies to succeed, they must gain sufficient social acceptance, as implementing transition policies in a democratic context requires a certain level of public approval. However, as the impacts of these policies become more apparent, resistance and support for low-carbon transitions have become contentious topics. This resistance is often voiced by various groups, political parties, and community leaders, which highlights the complex and conflictual nature of sustainability transitions. This study focuses on understanding the resistance to climate policies by analyzing how social movements use moral arguments to delegitimize low-carbon transition policies. Specifically, we examine the Swedish social media movement Fuel Revolt and their opposition to low-carbon transport policies in Sweden. The Fuel Revolt's resistance is framed within the broader context of global resistance movements against transition policies, such as the Yellow Vests in France and similar movements in Germany, Norway, and the UK. These movements share concerns about unfairness, inefficiency, lack of trust, and ideological differences. Unfairness is a major factor in resistance, with perceptions of unjust distributional impacts from carbon pricing affecting lower-income households disproportionately. This sense of unfairness fuels dissent, especially among those already facing economic hardships. Ineffectiveness and inefficiency are also central concerns. Many argue that carbon taxes burden households without significantly reducing emissions, as people still need to drive regardless of fuel prices. This perception weakens the perceived legitimacy of such policies. Lack of trust in policymakers is another recurring theme. There is skepticism about whether governments will use tax revenues from carbon taxation appropriately, and a sense that economic and social elites benefit at the expense of ordinary citizens. Norms, identity, and ideological positioning further shape resistance. For instance, the German Defenders of Diesel movement reflects a strong automobility culture and a desire to preserve existing structures, leading to emotional and ideological opposition to transition policies. These factors collectively structure organized resistance to transition policies. Understanding how these attitudes are channeled through social movements into potent political attacks on the legitimacy of transitions requires in-depth analysis. Our analytical framework focuses on the moral elements of delegitimation practices. These practices involve claims about the unjustifiability of policies based on shared beliefs within the political community rather than individual opinions on legitimacy. By examining the Fuel Revolt as a case study, we explore how social protest movements act as collective agents in these delegitimation processes. We analyze the moral arguments they use to challenge the legitimacy and justifiability of climate policies. Social protest movements are inherently normative, aiming to change or resist changes in society. They use various political actions to achieve their objectives, from demonstrations to petitions and social media campaigns. Through the Fuel Revolt, we see how a general sentiment of dissatisfaction with mainstream climate policies can be transformed into a full-scale attack on their legitimacy. This movement illustrates how the ideals of a just transition can sometimes backfire. The insights gained from this case study can be applied to understand similar resistance movements in other contexts. By recognizing the role of moral arguments in delegitimation practices, policymakers can better address the concerns of resistance movements. The Fuel Revolt's arguments link the perceived unfairness and inefficiency of low-carbon policies to broader moral and ethical issues, amplifying their impact on public discourse and policy debates. This underscores the importance of addressing moral considerations in policy design. Understanding these dynamics can help in creating more socially acceptable and just transition policies, ensuring that the necessary changes to combat climate change can be implemented effectively and sustainably. In conclusion, the study of the fuel revolt highlights the crucial role that moral arguments play in the resistance to low-carbon transition policies. By addressing these moral concerns, policymakers can improve the legitimacy and acceptance of necessary climate actions. Fuel for Revolt: Moral Arguments as Delegitimation Practices in Swedish Fuel Protests. In today's video, we'll explore the role of moral arguments in delegitimizing low-carbon transition policies through the lens of Swedish fuel protests. We'll start by understanding why social acceptance is crucial for the successful implementation of low-carbon policies in a democratic society. Recently, transition policies aimed at combating climate change have faced increasing resistance and protests, making it essential to examine the reasons behind this backlash. This video focuses on the case of the social media group Fuel Revolt 2.0a in Sweden, which has been vocal against low-carbon transport policies. Through qualitative interviews with Fuel Revolt members, we analyzed the central arguments and moral considerations they use against these policies. Our findings show how moral arguments can instill urgency and generalized demands to delegitimize mainstream transition policies. Recognizing these moral arguments can contribute to better analysis and more effective policies in addressing climate resistance. Organized resistance against low-carbon transition policies can delay or prevent necessary changes to combat climate change. We review literature on attitudes toward transition policies and case studies on resistance movements in the transport sector. The Yellow Vests movement in France is a well-known example of resistance against raised diesel taxes, which sparked protests in 2018. Other examples include Germany's Defenders of Diesel, Norway's People's Action No to Toll Roads, and the UK's protests against ultra-low emission zones. Four broad categories explain resistance against transition policies: perceptions of unfairness, inefficiency, lack of trust, and ideological positioning. Perceptions of unfairness often relate to the economic burden on lower-income households and the lack of transport alternatives in rural areas. Ineffectiveness and inefficiency are also key factors, with objections that carbon taxes incur costs without significantly reducing emissions. Lack of trust in policymakers is common, with concerns about the proper use of tax earnings from carbon taxation. Despite the urgent need to address climate change, many transition policies face opposition. Protests and resistance have emerged worldwide, challenging the methods and goals of these policies. This has led to a political backlash against climate initiatives. Resistance to climate policies is often framed as a conflict over justice. These policies can become highly politicized, with debates about their fairness and effectiveness. Understanding this resistance is key to developing better policies and achieving sustainability goals. This article focuses on the moral arguments used by social movements to delegitimize low-carbon transition policies. We study the Swedish social media movement, Fuel Revolt, which opposes transport sector policies, to see how moral considerations strengthen their arguments. The Fuel Revolt movement argues that mainstream climate policies are unjust and harmful to the majority. By analyzing their moral arguments, we can see how they turn general discontent into a powerful critique of climate policies, highlighting the pitfalls of a just transition. Resistance to transition policies can delay or derail necessary changes. Literature on this topic includes survey-based research on attitudes and case studies on resistance movements, especially in the transport sector. These studies help us understand the socio-political dynamics at play. Attitude research often examines factors that shape policy acceptance or resistance, such as perceptions of fairness and trust in policymakers. Case studies of resistance movements like the Yellow Vests in France provide deeper insights into the motivations behind opposition. Unfairness is a common theme in resistance to transition policies. People often perceive these policies as economically burdensome, especially for lower-income households, or as lacking alternatives in rural areas. This perceived unfairness fuels opposition. Ineffectiveness and inefficiency are other major concerns. Critics argue that some policies do little to combat climate change while imposing high costs on households. This perception that policies are economically damaging without significant benefits leads to resistance. Lack of trust in policymakers and the political process is another key factor. Many people doubt that governments will use tax revenues from carbon taxes effectively. This mistrust is a significant driver of opposition to transition policies. Norms, identity, and ideological beliefs also influence resistance. For example, strong car cultures and a sense of economic insecurity can lead people to oppose policies that threaten their way of life or seem to favor elites over ordinary citizens. These factors shape organized resistance to transition policies. However, to understand how these attitudes translate into political action, we need to explore the moral elements of these movements. This deeper analysis can reveal how social movements challenge the legitimacy of climate policies. Delegitimation practices actively reduce the perceived legitimacy of a policy. These practices can be argumentative, structural, or behavioral. Argumentative practices involve claims that a policy is unjust based on shared political beliefs. Social protest movements like the Fuel Revolt use moral arguments to delegitimize climate policies. These movements are normative, seeking to change or resist societal changes. They employ various political actions, from demonstrations to social media campaigns. The Fuel Revolt case illustrates how moral arguments can be powerful tools in resistance movements. By framing policies as unjust, these movements can mobilize, support, and challenge the legitimacy of climate action, highlighting the importance of moral considerations in policy debates. Understanding the moral arguments used by resistance movements can help policymakers design more acceptable and effective climate policies. Recognizing the importance of fairness and trust can lead to better engagement with the public and more successful transitions. In conclusion, resistance to low-carbon transition policies is multifaceted and deeply rooted in perceptions of fairness, effectiveness, trust, and ideology. By analyzing these factors and the moral arguments employed by social movements, we can develop better strategies for achieving sustainable and just climate policies.